On Friday, the Israelis announced a ceasefire to enable the transfer of hostages from Gaza back into Israel, as well as for humanitarian aid to pass through. 11 Israeli hostages were released within the last hour, with Palestinian prisoners expected to be released next. Around 30 prisoners have been released so far. However, according to the Israelis, terrorists broke the humanitarian truce within a mere 15 minutes. And yet, as we've had several weeks of so-called ceasefire protests, the usual suspects took to the streets on Saturday, not to protest at Hamas's breach of the ceasefire, but to continue to berate Israel. Perhaps it goes to show that they aren't in favour of peace, they simply hate the Jewish state. The Islamists were back in their droves, calling for Muslim armies to invade Israel, with some women getting arrested for their signs reading, "How beautiful it is to be a soldier of Allah," not to mention the fact that GBNews reporter Catherine Foster was tormented. So the question is, if a ceasefire won't make the protesters happy, what will? Well, joining me now is a friend of the programme and former Jeremy Corbyn advisor, James Schneider. James, thank you very much for joining me. In the context of the march that took place at the weekend, shouldn't they be marching for peace and to remind Hamas to obey the terms of the ceasefire?
I really have to completely push back on your categorisation of the marches, Jacob. These are peace marches and marching for a permanent ceasefire. Now, when we're talking about breaches of the temporary ceasefire, Israel continued to carry out some operations in the north of Gaza during the ceasefire and have arrested in the West Bank, taken as prisoner in the West Bank, as many people as they have released. So I think it is a ridiculous thing to suggest that the protests were not pushing for peace. Of course they are. They're calling for a full ceasefire, not a return to the bombing. Not what the Israeli defense minister briefing troops earlier today said, which is that they would return at the same levels of intensity and throughout the Gaza Strip, north, central and south.
But in terms of the march, a number of people have been arrested, including the ones I mentioned. A number of flags were there, the jihadist flags. Shouldn't those people be outside the marches and the marchers make sure that they're controlling the organisation properly so that they don't have these extremists with them?
Well, the images on the screen right now are of a Hizb ut-Tahrir splinter demonstration, which was outside of the march. Now, the vast majority of the marchers are marching for a righteous cause, which is peace and for the national liberation of the Palestinian people, because there can be no long-term peace until the occupation is ended and there is a just settlement for the Palestinians. Now, of course, with any large march, and we saw the same thing on Sunday as we saw on Saturday, there will be some fringe elements. But the general thrust of the ongoing peace marches are a call for peace, because we can't just have a pause in the killing. We already have something like 1.8 million residents of Gaza displaced from their homes. We have hundreds of children who have had amputations. We have over 15,000 civilians killed, an enormous loss of life, and the entire destruction of the Strip.
But James,
most of it now for rubble.
James, how can we have peace if Hamas uses Gaza as a base for its terrorist attacks, if Israel doesn't actually manage to root out the terrorists?
In order to have peace, we need to have a negotiated settlement between all sides and a long-term solution to the decades-long dispossession of the Palestinian people.